Hello. I'll start now. I'll introduce myself, apparently. So, welcome everybody. How are you? Have you been having fun here in NG Vegas? Awesome. We need a little bit of energy now because it's kind of late, and I know everybody is maybe sleepy or needs some coffee, so I'll try to make it fast. So, I'm really glad to be here. First, because we're in Vegas. Well, I don't know if we're in Vegas. I was told that if I'm not on the Strip, I'm not really on Vegas, but I don't know. And second, because I'll be sharing here something that I've been working with the past year. So last year, I joined Auth0, which is a company that helps with authentication, and also I love AngularJS, and I've been playing a lot around with Angular too. So the objective of this talk is to speak not only about a token walks into SPA. That's actually a really fancy name. The real name of the talk would be this, but it doesn't fit on the screen, which is learn how to create a small Angular application which has login, sign up, calling an API, and it also uses the router. So we'll start with a little introduction of how we can do this authentication in Angular 2, and then we'll do live coding to see how it goes. So let me start first by introducing myself. My name is Martín Gontovnicas. My Twitter handle is mgonto. And I am a software developer from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I work at Auth0, which, as I was saying, is a SaaS that helps with authentication and authorization. You basically pick an SDK like AngularJS, Node.js, PHP, since we are with Looper as well, and you just hook it to your app and get authentication working in your app. So I used to be there coding JavaScript all day long. So this was me. I was just like touching the keyboard and programming. But now I work as a developer advocate. A lot of people ask me, what does it mean to be a developer advocate? And I think I've always wanted to do this. This picture is when I was 17 years old. I was singing in a karaoke. So I was also on stage. But instead of actually speaking about technology, I was singing. And I like to think that I do the Gonto World Tour, where I speak at conferences. And of course, to speak at conferences, you got to learn things. So still, I am programming. But let's start with a talk. So first, I want to start by thinking, how does most of the web work right now? And we have like the browser and the server, basically. And let's imagine that we go to any website. For example, I bought a Mac last week on apple.com. So basically, I wanted to buy it, so I needed to sit there, and then I needed to first log in. That means that I needed to sit, type in my username and password, and click on login. That would send a post request to the server. And the server would first check that the username exists, that the password match, and if everything matched, it would create a user object in the session. The session is basically an in-memory store where all the authenticated users are kept. And once that happens, that user object in the session will have an ID. That ID will be sent in the response to the client on a cookie. And cookies are built in the browser. So that means that, again, now that I'm logged in, I click on buy computer. Basically, it will check that the domain is the same because it's apple.com, the same domain that I logged in. So the browser will automatically send the cookie for me, and the cookie will have the user ID. So once the server receives it, it will first get the user ID from there. It will search in the session to see if there's a user object with that. If it is, then it will go, I don't know, take out my money because I bought the computer, and then send the response. And this used to work well with regular web apps, but now, if we are here, this means that we are building single-page apps. And it doesn't work that well here. Why is that? Because first, cookies don't play well with cores. If you have ever built a single-page app, if you have coded Angular, you probably had this error like, what is cores? And then you Google it, you enter to Stack Overflow, a big explanation. And if you're using cookies, it's even more difficult because you have to set this with credentials and some other stuff, which isn't that cool. Also, as I was saying, cookies require stateful servers. Why is that? Because the server has to keep, as I was saying, an in-memory list of authenticated users, which is called the session. And that's not really cool, because that means if I log in on server 1, and then I want to buy on the server 3, I won't be logged in server 3, and it will say, no, you can't buy it. And to solve that, I need either like a centralized store like Mongo or Redis or something like that, or I could have sticky sessions, but it's problematic. And also, if I'm building a single-page app, that means that I like basically having an API. And APIs should be stateless. Because if we have stateless things, if we have no side effects, everything is easier to test, easier to debug, and easier to maintain. Basically, what I want is that given an X request, the API does something, and it always returns Y. If we have an in-memory session, that means that given a certain request, depending on what's on the in-memory session, the request will be different. And that sucks. And then the other thing is that cookies don't flow. That means that if I am calling an API, and then that API calls another API, that doesn't work well, because cookies are built in the browser, but they are not actually built in when I'm calling another API. So what I want to propose is a better approach, which is a token-based authentication, and specifically using JSON Web Tokens. I will first show you 1 second what a JSON Web Token is, and then we'll see how the flow would work for a single-page app. So in here, what we have on the left is basically a JSON Web Token. And the idea of this token is that it's similar to any other token, but the main difference is that in the middle, we have something that is the payload, which is what we see here. And in here, we can put whatever we want. So basically, we would put here like the user ID, the name, and all the credentials for the user to identify it. And if I, for example, type here, you will see that the token keeps on changing. And that's because this payload is part of the token. Then we also have the header, which given the spec says which is the type, which is JSON Web Token, and which algorithm is used to sign it. We'll see more about signing in a second. In this case, we've chosen HMAC 256. So what we do then is we base64 URL encode the header, we join it with a payload with a period, and then we just sign it with a particular secret that the server knows. And that will create this signature, which will let us verify that this token was created by my servers. So now that we understand this, let's see how the approach would work. Again, I go to apple.com, and I need to log in. So again, I enter the username and the password, and after entering the username and password, I click login. That would do a post. And now the server, instead of actually creating a user object in the memory in session, the only thing it has to do is create a JSON Web Token. So it will create a token, signing it with a secret that is shared among all of my servers, and that token will have the user ID. And then that is returned to the application, to my single-page app. Now, my single-page app, when I click on Buy, it will need to send this JSON Web Token to the server to let it know that I'm authenticated. And how we do that is we send an authorization header, and we put authorization, bearer, and the token. Now the server, it just needs to check whether this token was created and signed with the secrets that all my server knows. If that's true, then it means that this token is valid. And if this token is valid, I can just get the user ID from the token. That means that I need no side effect. I mean no in-memory nothing. And then once I get the user ID, I just go grab it from the database and take out his money because he's buying the computer. And finally, send a response. So once I saw this for the first time, I was like, I wasn't sure how this all worked. So basically now I'll stop talking, and I'll be coding a live demo with Angular 2 for this. A couple of warnings for this. Warning number 1. So all the code that I will be showing today is with Angular 2, which means that it's still being developed. And some of the stuff that I've coded is actually deprecated. That's what David told me. And the second warning is that, well, it's live coding, so things like this might happen. So it might blow up like this or right like this, but we'll try not to. So if you want to see the example, it's on github.com/auth0/Angular2 authentication sample. So let me show it to you. Let me start the server. And let me show you first how the app works, how the app looks. So sorry. So this is creating the bundles for Angular 2, and once it finishes, it takes like 1 or 2 seconds. It will let me know. I can tell a joke maybe. So now that it's loaded, this is what we have right now. We have this welcome to ngVega sample, which is like my homepage, and then, well, the URL for the router isn't yet implemented, so I created like a text box, which will be our URL from the browser. because it's not yet in master. And then what we have now is this call anonymous API, which is just calling an API that returns random Chuck Norris phrases. So each time that I click it, I get a new Chuck Norris phrase. And then I have this call secure API, which gives me an extra 50 phrases from Chuck Norris, but it needs to be authenticated. And it's saying no authorization header was found because I'm not sending it. So the first thing that we need to do here is to build the login page. But first, let's see the code for this sample that we have right now. So if we open Sublime, we'll see that first we have this in the source folder, we have in the application itself. We are creating this auth app, which is my application. I'm saying which is the app/app.html, which will be the basic HTML. And then in here, I'm configuring the router for the Angular 2. This router basically is saying we'll have the home URL, which will point to the home component, which is the one that is already made. And then once it loads, it will navigate to the home. And that's all we have basically for now. Then if we go to the home, this is the HTML that I just showed you. And in the home.js, all we have right now is the API calls, which are using fetch in this case. And this is something that I think is really nice about Angular 2, that as it's like just including ES6 modules, I can work with whatever I want. And in this case, I'm using the fetch API, which is like the new XML HTTP request API for just getting resources. So now that we know this, the first thing that we need to do then is implement the login. So for that, we'll come here to the app.js, and we'll register this a new route, which will be the login. So let's say that after the home is configured, let's actually configure the login. So I'll do something that we all love as developers, which is copy-pasting. So let's get here the login. We'll say that this will be the login component, and in here, we'll alias it as login. Now, we need to actually get the login component. So for that, we'll do an import of login from, and the file will be in the login/login.html. Sorry, not the HTML, login. Now, if we go to the login folder, we'll see that we already have the HTML done, because I'm not good at designing, so we have the HTML, but the JavaScript is empty. So what we need to do is to create this component. So for that, first, we'll export the class login. And in here, we have to say, OK, this will be a component, and the selector for this component will be actually login. And then we need to specify which will be the template for this. So we're going to say that the view for this, the template URL will be login/login.html. Once we have this, now we can start coding the implementation for this. So first, we'll have the constructor. And now we need to be able to call from the template to some method that will do the login. So for that, let's go to the HTML. And in the form, let's add the submit call. So in here, we'll do a submit. And when we're submitting, in this case, we'll say, let's do a login with the event. And here I need to send the username and the password that the user is filling. So for that, we will get the username input, and we'll identify it with an ID. To identify something with Angular 2, you can just say hash username. And for the password, you can say hash password. And now I can reference this input from whatever I want from my code. So that means that now, if I'm in here, I can say, give me the username.value, and give me the value for the password. And with this, we're calling this login method. So let's actually create it. So if we come here, we will do, OK, we'll do the login with the event, username, and the password. And what we will have here is we will just need to call this the endpoint from the server that will create that will log the user in and create the JSON Web Token. That endpoint is actually in here. It is this sessions create, and it just checks the username and the password, and all it does is just return in the ID token field the JSON Web Token, which I create in here. So what I need to do is call this sessions create endpoint. So let's do the fetch API call to this endpoint. So it will be localhost sessions create. And in this case, we'll say, OK, the method will be a post. And in this case, we are going to send some JSON. So we'll say that the content type is application JSON. And we are going to accept exactly that. It would be application JSON. And finally, we need to send in the body the username and the password. So for that, we'll say that the body will be the JSON.stringify of basically the username and the password that we got as a parameter from the view. And once we have this, that's it. Now, we're going to use some helpers that I created for the fetch API, which basically converts the response to a JSON. And in case there's an error, it will throw an error. And once I have that done, then I will in here get the response. And from the response, I need to now get the JSON Web Token. And what I'll do is I'll just save it in local storage to keep the user logged in. So I'll do local storage.setItem JWT, and it will be response.id token. And once the user is logged in, I need to redirect him to the home page. So for that, what I will do is I will inject the router. Thanks to DI, I will be able to inject it. I will assign it locally somewhere. And now I can just come here and do this.router.parent.navigate, and we're going to go to the home. Let's catch in case there's an error, because usually there are errors. Hopefully not. And we'll do a console.log of the error. And we do an alert of the error as well. And with this, we should actually have implemented our login. So let's see if it works. And for that, let's say that in our app.js, we will go by default to the login. So let's save, and now let's pray together. So if I refresh this, boom, I have my login. Let's see if there's an error. There's not really an error, so that's good. So now let's try to actually call the login. So let's put something and something. And if I click submit, it says failed to fetch, which means that I made a mistake. Awesome. First, I know that I forgot the event.prevent default. And now let's try again. This is what can happen. Let's see what it is. Oh, it's good. It's saying the username or password don't match, which is actually true because I have created a mock-up user, which is Gonto Gonto. So let's now try with that user Gonto Gonto. And we click on submit now. And boom, now we're in the home. But nothing is still happening. So let's actually display this JSON Web Token that we got. So we'll say now that in the app.js, we'll default to go to the home. And let's first, in the home.js, let's get this JWT. So we saved this JWT in local storage. So we can just get it and do something like local storage.getItem JWT. And now if we refresh it, now we can see the JSON Web Token. Another thing is that this JSON Web Token, as I was saying, has content inside. So we can actually show it. And for that, we'll just save it in another variable, which is decoded JWT. And we'll say if there's a JSON Web Token, then we'll call this JWT decode, which is from an external library that I included. And once we have this, let's actually show it in here. So let's do another thing, copy paste. And in here, let's say instead of decoded JWT, it will be decoded JWT. And we will be using a pipe, which is a new name for the filters, that is called JSON. I will show it 1 second just to show how it works. But basically, this is how you create a filter now. You have this JSON pipe factory, which creates a new pipe, which is a new filter. In this case, this is singleton, so I return this. And my filter is just a JSON.stringify. So let's see how it works now. And now we have here the content of the JSON Web Token. So now, if I click on Call Secure API, do you think that this will work? It will return a Chuck Norris face? Hands up who thinks that it will work. OK, good. Let's try it out. So if we click on Call Secure API, it's still not working. And why is that? Because authentication in a single-page app isn't really stateful. That means that authentication for a single-page app is just sending a JSON Web Token to an API. Now I am logged in. I have this JSON Web Token, but I'm not sending it when I call an API. So what we need to do is actually, if we have it, we need to send it. So let's go back to our code. And in the home.js now, when we're calling this, the URL to fetch the phrase, let's add a new header, which is authorization. And it will be bearer. And we'll add the JWT here. Now if we refresh the page, and we click on Call Secure API, boom. now we're getting the response. So now another thing that is important about single-page apps is that authentication on them doesn't really exist. Why? Because now, if I don't want to show this homepage if somebody is not logged in. But if I come here to the resources and I delete from here the JSON Web Token, and I refresh, I am able to see this page. So what I would want is for the user not to be able to see the home if he's not logged in. So how do we do that? In the app.html, what we have now is this router outlet, which is basically where the content of the current route will be shown. And as we see before, we can use this can activate method from the router outlet to actually say, we don't want to go to that route if the user is not authenticated. So for that, we can actually extend from the router outlet. And in this case, we're going to create something that is called a directive. Don't read this decorator because it's deprecated. It doesn't exist anymore in Master and Angular 2. But the NPM version is not still there. Thank you, David. So this will be a directive, which will be basically a component that doesn't have an HTML. So in this case, what I'm going to say is that we're not going to be able to go to the home if the user is not logged in. So for that, we'll add this can activate function, which we inherit actually from the router outlet. And in here first, we'll get the URL from the router. This was the most difficult thing to remember by heart for the presentation, last navigation attempt. And once we get the URL, what we're going to say is that if the URL is not login, so that means if the URL needs authentication and there is not a JWT stave, then we're going to redirect the user to the login. And for that, we're going to say that the component for this instruction will actually be the login. And once that's finished, as the router uses promises, we need to respond the promise. And for that, we can just do promise wrapper.result with true. And once we have this, then we can now use this logged in router outlet instead of the default one that is provided by Angular 2. So we come here, we change this here, and we refresh the page. And now we couldn't be able to go to the home. Let's try again to go to the home. I click on go, and it doesn't do anything. So I log in now. Now it's going to the home. Now let's go to the login. Do you like my mimic URL handler? And then if we go back to the home and we click on go, now it does go. Because now this logged in router outlet is taking place. So my last question that I want to ask you is like, so I have this JSON Web Token which has contents. So if I actually copy it, and then I now go to this JSON Web Token page, I can see the content. So let's modify it and say that I am the EID 2, and the user is, I don't know, John. So now I copy this new JSON Web Token, I go to my example, and I cheat. So I go to local storage, and this JWT, I will change it by the one that I created. Now if I click on call secret API, who thinks that it will work, and it will work with another user? Good, because it won't work, because it was signed with another secret that the server doesn't know. So now if I click on call secure API, oh, I had to refresh the page, sorry. Now it's saying unauthorized error, invalid signature. And that makes sense because it wasn't signed with the secret that the server knows. So let me go back 1 second to the presentation now. So this is basically all for the presentation. I hope you understood a little bit about Angular 2. But one more thing before ending. If you want to try out Auth0, you can go to auth0.com/signup, which basically does this same that I did for Angular 2, but a little bit easier without having to implement everything. So thank you again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.